Towers by Nigel Hinton. Maybe none of it would have happened if Philip had listened to his father's warning not to play with the kite on his own. Maybe, but who can tell with magic? His uncle had brought it back as a present from China, and it really was the biggest and best you've ever seen. It was shaped like a dragon and was coloured red, yellow and green. Philip wanted to go out and fly it at once, but his father said he had to wait until the weekend. The weekend? That was 4 whole days away. Philip put the kite in the corner of his bedroom. Every time he looked at it, he heard a voice whispering in his head. "Go on," the voice said. "Go on, it'll be good fun." For 2 days, Philip managed to say no to the voice, but on the 3rd day he gave in. He picked up the kite and opened his bedroom door as quietly as possible. The kite was so big that by the time he reached the top of the hill in the park, he was out of breath. Then, after all that, there wasn't even the slightest breeze. For a quarter of an hour, he ran up and down trying to make the kite fly, but each time it just flapped back to the ground. After one final go, he gave up. He looked up. A small, round black cloud was racing across the blue sky. He felt the kite move in his hand. The long dragon's tail wagged from side to side like a dog when it sees a friend. The cloud got nearer and nearer the sun. It grew darker, and Philip waited for the shadow to pass. But when he looked up, the cloud had stopped directly in front of the sun. Its shadow formed a perfect circle all around him. Then, out of nowhere, came the wind, whistling and spinning and howling. Philip closed his eyes. He felt his arms rise up above him as the wind caught the kite and lifted it. For a moment he thought of letting go, but there was a sudden tug, and it was too late. When he opened his eyes, he was already 20 feet above the ground and rising fast. It was most peculiar. He wasn't afraid, and he was as comfortable as if he were sitting in an armchair. He looked down and saw the road he lived in. It was so high that the cars and houses looked like toys, even his house. Soon Philip couldn't see his town anymore, and there were fields below him. The fields became mountains with snow on their tops. One mountain was so high that Philip's feet touched the shining snow on the top. And all the time, the little round cloud led the way, and the kite followed with its long dragon's tail dancing in the breeze. Below him the mountains grew smaller and smaller. There were trees on them now instead of snow. Away in the distance, Philip could see a long line of blue. He watched as the kite carried him towards it, and he finally saw that it was the sea. Philip was so busy watching all the life in the sea that he almost let go of the kite in shock when he felt something land on his shoulder and tap him on the ear. It was a robin. "Hello," Philip said. The robin jumped in surprise at Philip's voice and flew off his shoulder and circled round him, singing very excitedly. Philip wondered what a robin was doing out here, so far out at sea. Soon the robin landed nervously on one of his feet. He snuggled himself down on Philip's shoe and held one end of the shoelace in his beak so that he wouldn't fall off. Then he tucked his head down under his wing and went to sleep. The kite flew on and on. Now the big red sun was beginning to sink slowly in the west. "I wish I could go to sleep like you, Robin," he said that aloud. There was a rustling noise, and Philip felt the tail of the kite wrap itself tight round his body and his arms. Now he could go to sleep without falling off. He let go of the wooden crosspiece of the kite. For a moment he was scared that the tail might not hold him, but he felt it tighten round him comfortably, and he knew that he was safe. He closed his eyes, and the gentle swaying of the kite rocked him to sleep. When he woke up, the sun was already warming his back. He felt the kite's tail twitch around him as if it were trying to say something. Perhaps it was tired of holding him. He reached up and held onto the kite. The tail unwrapped itself and fluttered up to its proper position. At once, the kite changed direction. There was a movement on his shoe, and Philip looked down to see the robin waking up. The bird shook his head, flapped his wings, and puffed out his lovely red chest. With a whir of wings, the robin flew up and perched on Philip's shoulder. Quietly, so as not to scare him, Philip said, "Good morning. I hope you slept well." The robin gave a little bob, and Philip couldn't help laughing because it was just as if the bird had understood what he said and was giving him an answer. The laugh frightened the robin, and he hopped a couple of times until he was further away from Philip's face. He stood on one of the folds on Philip's anorak. Finally, Philip couldn't hold it in any longer, and he burst out laughing. The robin jumped up in the air with fright and started flying round and round. "I'm sorry, Robin. I didn't mean to scare you, but it's so funny when I talk to you, and you barb up and down as if you understand me." The robin had been flying round Philip's head, but now his wings stopped. He was furious. He opened his beak as though to say something, and then dropped like a stone. He had been so angry that he'd forgotten to keep flapping his wings. Philip watched him tumble and roll down through the air. "Flap your wings!" Philip shouted, but even before he finished saying it, the robin had started flying properly again. Philip watched as the robin climbed up towards him. He settled back on the anorak ledge, and his tiny red chest heaved up and down. "I'm sorry," said Philip gently. "You can understand what I say, can't you?" The robin bobbed. "It's just, I never realised that birds could understand human beings." The robin bobbed violently and shook his head. "They can't," Philip said. The robin shook his head again. "Oh, just you." The robin's chest swelled out with pride. The red feathers seemed to get redder, as if the bird was blushing. "You're very clever, then," Philip said. The robin bobbed and put his head shyly under his wing. "Perhaps you could tell me where we're going." The robin turned and pointed with his beak. Ahead of them, Philip could see 2 islands. One was very large and was shaped like the letter N. The other one was a small, round island, just a circle of bare rock like an O. The kite dipped its nose and started to cruise down towards the large island. Philip came down with a bump. He let go of the kite, and it flew just a little way to a narrow gap between 2 rocks. It settled between the rocks, and the long dragon tail curled itself round and round in a neat pile by its side. The little cloud sat bouncing on one of the rocks. As it bounced, it changed from black to white and grew thinner and thinner. With a faint sigh, it disappeared, leaving only a damp mark on the rock. Philip suddenly felt very lonely. The robin was nowhere to be seen. He stood up and looked around. He was in a clearing in the forest. Which way should he go? He didn't want to end up lost. There might be wild animals. On the other hand, he couldn't just stay here. He made up his mind to be brave and started walking towards the trees. Just where the path went into the forest, the robin flew down from the top of a bush and landed on Philip's shoulder. The robin's happy song helped make the forest seem a little less gloomy. They came to a rushing stream with stepping stones across it. Philip had just jumped from the last stone onto the path at the other side when he felt a rumbling in the ground. The robin squeaked and flew into the bushes. The air grew colder, and there was the thunder of galloping hooves. Without knowing why, Philip dived into the ferns and lay hidden under some bushes as the noise grew louder. The ground shook and pounded, and big chunks of earth flew through the leaves and branches. The noise stopped. Whoever, or whatever it was, had halted on the path next to where he was hiding. There was absolute silence for a moment. Then a growling sound. Philip twisted his head and looked up through the ferns. 2 huge black horses towered above him. The riders were dressed in red robes. They had their backs to him, but he knew from the horrible noises that they made that they were not men. They were sniffing the air like dogs and then growling to each other. They turned and Philip saw green eyes, black hairy faces, wolf-like snouts, and pointed yellow teeth. They sniffed and started to look down towards him, as if they had caught his scent. He heard a flutter of wings, and he saw a blur of red fly past him towards the riders. It was the robin. The bird darted and dived just out of reach of the snapping jaws, then landed on the head of one of the horses. Philip's chest grew tight as the rider raised a hairy claw and brought it crashing down towards the robin. At the last second, the little bird flew off and the claw hit the horse's neck. The poor beast snorted and reared into the horse in front. The horses leapt to the water, and Philip stood up to watch as they thundered away down the path with their riders' red robes flying in the wind. As soon as they were out of sight, Philip ran in the opposite direction. The robin flew down and landed on Philip's knee. He let Philip reach out and stroke the feathers on the top of his head. "Thank you for saving me. You were very brave," Philip said. "We'd better not stay here, Robin. Those horrible things on horses might be back looking for us. Is it far to the end of the forest?" The robin bobbed and shook his head. He jumped onto Philip's shoulder as he got up and started along the path. The trees were becoming less dense, and the light was less gloomy. Streaks of sunlight were shining down through the leaves. Philip was just beginning to feel happy that he could see the end of the forest when he heard a strange noise. It was coming from beyond the trees, somewhere out in the sunshine. He moved closer and listened again. Someone with a most extraordinary voice was singing a song. "Swing, swang, 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 listen to my swinging song. Swing low, swing high, I'm as big as does the sky." Philip peered from behind a tree and gasped with amazement. The singer was a small beaver who was flying back and forth on a tiny swing that hung from the lowest branch of an apple tree. A little way behind this tree there was a cosy-looking cottage. The small beaver started his song again and swung up and down so hard that the whole tree rocked. A ripe apple tumbled from the top of the tree and hit the beaver on the shoulder. The shock made him let go of the swing, and he toppled backwards off the seat. He managed to catch hold of the rope with his foot, but he suddenly found himself swinging upside down with his nose an inch above the ground. "Help! Help! I'm falling in!" he shouted. Philip was just about to dash to the rescue when a large badger rushed out of the cottage, almost tripping over her apron. She was carrying some knitting, and in her speed she had forgotten about the ball of wool which came rolling behind her out of the front door. "Now don't make a fuss, baby bee. I warned you about swinging too hard," she said, dropping the knitting and trying to catch hold of the swing. "Help!" shouted Baby Bee and grabbed her apron as he swung past. The sudden jerk pulled the badger off balance and she fell over. Baby Bee waited until the swing came level with her again, then kicked his foot free from the rope. He sailed through the air and crashed onto the poor badger's tummy, knocking all the wind out of her with a tremendous "Oh! Oh, thank you, Mrs. Badger," said Baby Bee, sliding to the ground. "You stopped me from getting hurted." Oh, gasped Mrs. Badger as she sat up slowly, trying to get her breath back. Oh, really, Baby Bee, you do get yourself in some pickles." "No, it wasn't a pickle, it was an apple. It bumped me on the shoulder, and I let go, and then I was falling in." "You weren't falling in, Baby Bee," Mrs. Badger said as she got to her feet. Oh, dear me, look at my knitting. All the stitches are off." She picked up the needles and started to slide the stitches back on. "Oh, dear me, Mrs. Badger, it's all over the garden," said Baby Bee. "I'll help you. I'm good at helping." He ran over to the ball of wool and picked it out of a rose bush. He started to roll it up as fast as he could, but it got caught round his leg, and the more he tried to get himself free, the more he got tangled up. "Help, Mrs. Badger! It's trying to knit me!" Mrs. Badger groaned and patiently began to unwind Baby Bee. She had just got him free and was about to roll the wool into a proper ball when she saw Philip peering from behind the tree. Her eyes grew wide as he walked towards her. Are you one of the witch's men?" she asked in a scared, gruff voice. "I don't think so," said Philip, "but I did come here by magic, on a kite all the way from my home, under a cloud, and a robin came to meet me and—" "A cloud? A robin?" interrupted the badger. "You mean you're the saver?" broke in the little beaver. "It's the saver! Hooray! Hooray! Hello, Mr. Saver! I can help you. I'm good at helping and I'm not scared." "Hush now, Baby Bee," said the badger. "Oh, go on, please, Mrs. Badger. Please let me help him, please." Baby Bee begged, tugging at her apron. "We'll see. Now stop making a fuss. First of all, you'd better take this gentleman to see Mr. Edgar at once. There must be some mistake. Oh, dear me. Oh, another mistake, and the witch will be here tomorrow, and, oh, dear me, first that silly car, and now, bless my soul, I'm forgetting my manners. What's your name? Philip. Well, Philip, Baby B will show you the way to the manor. Mr. Edgar will want to see you at once, and, oh, my, there's the robin. Baby B started to run as fast as his little legs could carry him, and Philip followed. Philip didn't have to walk too quickly in order to keep up, because Baby B's legs were very short, and he'd obviously only just learned how to run. They crossed the fields full of corn, and Philip noticed that it was ripe and should have been cut weeks before. All the hedges they passed were overgrown and filled with trailing brambles and weeds. Fences and gates were broken, and Philip was wondering why everything looked so ramshackle and run down, when he saw that Baby B had stopped near a thin line of trees that ran all the way back to the forest. When Philip reached him, Baby B looked up and giggled. "I'm not scared," Baby B said, and gripped Philip's hand. "Aren't you?" asked Philip. "No, I'm not scared because I'm 6. He looked up at Philip, and then looked down at the ground and said, "Well, I will be soon. I'm 2.5 now, but soon I'll be 6. "I expect so, though you'll probably have to be 3, 4, and 5 first," said Philip gently, because he could feel Baby B trembling. "When I will be 6, I won't be afraid of growlers, will I?" "No," said Philip. "Are you afraid of them now?" A bit," said Baby B, taking a step closer to Philip. If they eat me, I don't like it." "The growlers, Baby B, do they wear red robes and ride big black horses?" "Yes, and they have ever so big a teeth, and Mrs. Badger says, oh dear me, if the witch comes they'll be even worser, but you won't let them, will you?" "Well," began Philip. "Because you're the saver, aren't you?" Baby B said quickly, and he trembled so much that Philip smiled and nodded. Baby B tugged Philip's arm and pointed to a large building standing on the low hill. "So, that's the manor," thought Philip. "I certainly hope Mr. Edgar, whoever he is, will be able to solve the mystery." The manor was tumble down and uncared for. Baby B led the way along a corridor and down some twisting stone steps, then along an even darker corridor and down some even twistier steps. At the bottom of these steps was a small room. It was a huge fireplace with a pile of logs burning brightly. In front of the fireplace, a very large beaver sat in an armchair. He had a piece of paper on his lap and a pencil in his mouth, and he was fast asleep. Baby B ran across to the fire and lay down in front of it. He was so tired after all his running that he immediately curled up and went to sleep. The robin flew off Philip's shoulder and landed on the large beaver's knee. Philip tiptoed over to the armchair. The sleeping beaver had written some very strange letters on the paper, letters that looked like some kind of old magic spell. Philip shivered and wondered whether he ought to creep out of this house before it was too late. And yet this beaver didn't seem very frightening. In fact, he looked very friendly. His fur was all grey, and his kind old face was twitching in his sleep. Philip coughed politely and said, "Excuse me." The old beaver woke up with a start and saw the robin perch on his knee. He began, then realised he still had the pencil in his mouth. "Oh, drat the pencil! Sergeant Robin, you're back, me lad. Well then, was the mission a success? Should have been. I've been sitting here going over spell time and again. Did you bring him back?" The robin bobbed and whistled, then flew onto Philip's shoulder. The beaver turned and peered at Philip. "What? Oh, there you are. Splendid, splendid. Come round into the light. Now, Edgar's my name, by the way. Now, let's have a look at you. Bit on the small side, aren't you? Young, too. Bless my soul, what kind of uniform's that you're wearing?" "Excuse me, sir," said Philip. I think there must be some mistake."
"Mistake? Quite a pilot, chappie. That's what I asked for. Made it clear to the cloud when I cast the spell. Pilot chappie and his kite. That'll be the ticket to save us, I said."
"Kite?" said Philip.
"That's right. Kite. Aeroplane. Pilot chappie couldn't save us without a plane to fly, could he?"
"Oh dear," said Philip.
"Don't tell me it went wrong like last time. Asked for a tank, and what did I get? Dratted old banger of a car that doesn't work. Anyway, lad, make your report."
Philip told him everything. Well, well, said Mr. Edgar.
Quite an adventure, eh?
Mr. Edgar busied himself boiling a kettle on the fire and buttering some scones. Philip was very hungry and thirsty.
Now, brace yourself, my lad,
said Mr. Edgar as they sipped their tea and ate some scones.
I expect you saw the fields outside. Terrible state, eh? Didn't used to get like this? Oh, no. I used to live in Beaver Towers. Beautiful castle in the mountains on the other side of the island. You've heard of eager beavers and the busy beavers, of course?
Philip nodded.
Well, the two families joined, must be 500 years ago, and built Beaver Towers. You can see our crest above the main entrance. Always eager, always busy. We were the eagerest, busiest and happiest beavers you could find. Then one dark winter's night, 3 years ago, we were betrayed. A weasel, who was a guest in the castle, crept into the library and stole one of our books on ancient magic. We beavers are good at magic, and my family have the best collection of magic books in the world. Anyway, the sly thief went back to his room and started dabbling with some spells. Well, long and short of it was that the weasel accidentally magicked up a very nasty and evil piece of work. Oyin is what she's called. The cruelest witch in the whole world of blackness. The weasel was soon taught a dreadful lesson about meddling with magic. As soon as she appeared, Oyin picked him up with her long bony fingers and tossed him on the fire. I searched the castle from top to bottom. Of course, by the time I got to the weasel's room, he'd been roasted to a pile of ashes, and Oyin had flown out of the window into the depths of the forest. I saw the book of magic on the floor, and one glance at the open page told me what had happened. I spent hours in the library, looking for a spell that would undo the dreadful evil, but it was too late. Oyin hadn't wasted any time in the forest. She'd cast her spells and had made nearly 100 growlers. I suddenly heard their horrible howling and growling coming from the forest towards the castle. There was nothing for it but to bail out. I called everyone together, and we beat a swift retreat. Down we went, through an old secret passageway that leads from the library out of the castle, right to the edge of the forest.
A tear rolled down Mr. Edgar's furry cheek and plopped into his cup of tea. "Did the witch and the growlers come and attack?" asked Philip.
Attack? Oh, bless me, no. Oyin could only stay for 1 day. Witches can't stand goodness, and there was still too much good around for her liking. She scuttled back to her evil world like the slimy rat she is. She left her growlers to do her dirty work. The cunning devils would wait until one of us was alone in the forest or the fields, and then pounce. Each time they caught one of us, it meant that there was a little less goodness on our island. So the second time Oyin came out of the world of blackness, she managed to stay for nearly a week. In that time she made some more dratted growlers, and the more there are, the fiercer they become. Now they've caught nearly everyone. 2 months ago they got my son and his wife. That's Baby B's mother and father.
"So Baby B's an orphan, then?" said Philip.
"No, not quite. They're prisoners in the dungeons of the castle along with the others. They're all locked up there until Oyin's evil is complete, and then she'll throw them in the—"
Mr. Edgar nodded at the fire and shivered.
"Now there's just me, Baby B, Mrs. Badger, the robin and the 3 mechanics left. Hardly enough to stop the weakest witch, and certainly no match for Oyin. So tomorrow night, when she comes back for the 3rd time, she'll be able to stay forever. The end of our home. Oh, my spells just don't seem to work without my books. I get all the words muddled up. And the fact is, I just can't think of a dratted spell that will get you home."
Mr. Edgar patted Philip kindly. The old beaver and the young boy looked at the fire, and each thought of his home. In the silence nothing moved, except the reflections of the flames dancing in their eyes. Philip stopped staring at the fire and looked at the painting of a castle that hung over the mantelpiece. "Did you say there was a secret passage into the castle?" Philip asked thoughtfully.
That's correct."
Mr. Edgar turned with a puzzled frown.
"Why?"
"Well," began Philip.
"Now, young un," interrupted the old beaver, If you're thinking of bursting into the castle and rescuing all the prisoners, just forget it. The place is crawling with Oyin's dratted watchdogs."
"I know," said Philip eagerly, "but you said that the passageway came out in the library. Could I get in there and bring back one of your books of magic? If there was a book of escaping spells, you could magic the prisoners out of the castle and then get the cloud to take us all off the island."
"By Jove!" Mr. Edgar shouted and slapped his knee. "That's right! It might work. Me leaving our old island to Oyin, of course, but—" He slapped his knee again. "He who fights and runs away lives to fight another day."
All this slapping and shouting woke Baby Bee.
"Hello, Grandpa Edgar," he said, jumping up on Mr. Edgar's lap. "I bring the saver, didn't I?"
"You know what, Baby Bee? I think you did,"
said the old beaver, giving his grandson a hug.
"And I wasn't a bit scared of the growlers when we came through the trees,"
added Baby Bee proudly.
"That's a good lad. You're a chip off the old block.
Mind you, it's going to have to be bravery all round from now on. There's a special and highly dangerous mission taking place tonight."
Baby Bee bounced up and down on Mr. Edgar's lap and squeaked,
"Can I go too?" "Not right into the castle, no," he said, patting his grandson's head. "You must lead him through the forest and show him where the secret tunnel begins." "Will I have to come back all by myself?" Baby Bee said, shivering at the thought. "Aha! That's where our brave little Robin comes in. No, Sergeant Robin, I haven't forgotten you. I want you to go with Baby Bee and do the same thing for him."
The robin bobbed and flew down onto Baby Bee's shoulder to show that he knew what he had to do.
"Good," said Mr. Edgar. Then he turned to Philip. "Yours is the most dangerous job. The book you want is a big purple book, and it should be on the shelves next to the secret door."
Mr. Edgar stood up stiffly.
"Well, end of briefing. Any questions?"
They all shook their heads.
"In that case, take care and good luck."
"It's the silliest thing I've ever heard," said Mrs. Badger crossly.
"It's our only chance, Mrs. Badger," said Baby Bee. "The dratted witch comes tomorrow."
"Baby Bee," Mrs. Badger gasped. "Where did you learn that word?"
"Grandpa Edgar says it all the time. Drat the dratted witch, he says."
"Well, that's no excuse for you to do it. Now upstairs and wash at once while I make you something to eat. You too, Philip." Philip and Baby Bee went upstairs to the bathroom. Philip washed his hands and face, then Baby Bee stood on a chair in front of the basin and splashed and hummed and spilled water everywhere. Philip rubbed Baby Bee's face and hands with a towel and then gave him a piggyback down the steep stairs to the kitchen. All through the meal, Baby Bee tried saying Philip's name, but he kept getting it wrong. He tried Pilly, Lippy, and even
Philip.
But most often it came out as
Flippip.
Philip said that Baby Bee could call him Flippip because it was the easiest and anyway it was a good name. Baby Bee's chatter took Philip's mind off his worries. Even so, the flutters in his tummy made it hard to eat much, no matter how many times Mrs. Badger came to the table and said, "Now eat it all up, both of you." They helped wash up. Then Philip sat in the window seat, watching the trees in the forest grow blacker as the sun set behind them. He stood up and hoped that nobody would see how his knees shook. "Time to go, Baby Bee." The little beaver looked up from his colouring book and his eyes grew very wide. "Come on," said Philip, and took his little paw. "We'll be all right." At the front door, Mrs. Badger wrapped a scarf round Baby Bee's neck, and then she kissed them both on top of the head. "Be careful," she said. The robin flew down from his perch on the hat stand and landed on Baby Bee's shoulder. They'd only gone about 10 paces when they heard the first distant howl from the depths of the forest. At first it was so black that Philip couldn't even see where he was going. Baby Bee was much better at seeing in the dark, and he led Philip along the forest path. Soon Philip's eyes got used to the night, and he could make out shapes in the gloom. Baby Bee stopped suddenly. He sniffed, and then whispered to Philip,
"Growlers coming! Into the bushes, quick!"
They left the path and pushed their way through the bushes. Baby Bee sniffed again and said,
"Down!"
They lay on the ground. There was a long wait.
Philip's ears strained to hear the growlers, but all he heard was the sound of his own heart beating. Philip waited and waited, and then decided that it must have been a false alarm. He stood up as quietly as he could and looked over the bush that they'd been lying behind. Philip's skin went quite cold and prickly as 2 pairs of green eyes looked at him. He froze in fear. There was a growling noise, and the green eyes grew larger. The growlers were opening them wide in order to see better. They'd heard him, but they couldn't see him. On the other side of the path, a large nut made a loud rustling sound as it fell through the leaves, then a thud as it hit a branch. The growlers turned quickly to see what it was. Philip took a deep breath and lowered himself gently behind the bush. He felt Baby Bee's paw on his back, as though the little beaver were trying to stop him getting up again. Philip's heart knocked against his ribs, and he pressed his face into the pine needles. The seconds passed slowly into minutes. At last, Baby Bee lifted his paw from Philip's back and whispered, "They've gone." "You were very braver," whispered Baby Bee. "I thought you were going to bonk them on the head." Philip shook his head. "I was very silly, Baby Bee. I didn't know they were there." "Didn't you hearing them?" "I didn't hear them come, and I didn't hear them go." "Gosh, you've got funny ears." "Boys' ears aren't as good as beavers' ears, Baby Bee. Where are they now?" "Oh, they're millions away. Come on." Branches kept poking Philip, and brambles pulled at his legs, and he made awful scrunching sounds with every step. Baby Bee, who was moving almost without making a sound, kept turning round and going, "Shush." Philip tried even harder to be quiet, but at once he trod on a twig that broke with a loud snap. The robin started twittering softly. "Philip, Robin wants to know why you're pretending to be an elephant," said Baby Bee. "I'm not, but my feet seem to be treading on the noisiest things they can find." Baby Bee started to walk away and then came back a little shyly. "Philip," he said, "you're the bestest human beak I've ever met." "How many have you met?" "Only one, but even if I met lots, you'd still be the bestest." They decided to go on the path, because there would be less noisy things for Philip's feet to tread on. "We see the castle in a minute," Baby Bee whispered. They stopped behind a low pile of rocks, and Baby Bee pointed. In the glow of the misty moon, Beaver Towers looked cold and unfriendly. There were a few lights in some of the windows, and Philip could see the shadows of some growlers in the rooms, but most of the castle was in darkness. They crossed a small glade to a wall of rock. Baby Bee pulled some ferns aside and pointed to the stairs going down into the darkness. A strange, damp smell drifted up from the hole. Philip wished he didn't have to go down there. "There's 16 steps, Flip-Hip." "Thank you, Baby Bee. Will you be all right going back by yourself?" "I've got Robin." "Oh, of course you have. Well, good luck. I'd better get going." Philip went down the steps until his head was level with the ground. "Bye, Baby Bee. Bye, Robin," he said, and then, plucking up his courage, he started down the steps. 14, 15, 16. He was at the bottom. He looked up and saw Baby Bee's face peering through the ferns at the top of the steps. "Good luck," whispered Baby Bee. Philip had never been in such darkness in his whole life. It was like being blindfolded. He could only move by feeling his way along the slimy rock of the walls. Water dripped from the ceiling, and when a drop fell onto his shoulder, it was like a finger tapping him. Mr. Edgar had said that Oyin had long, bony fingers. Perhaps she'd come back a day early. Perhaps she was up there in the darkness, just waiting to grab him. He stumbled over some loose rocks on the floor and grazed his knee. But he walked on and on and on, and he realized that he must still be going towards the castle. Something made a flapping noise. Then there was another flap near him, and another. Then there was a loud boom as thousands of wings started flapping. Things were flying past him. Bats. He
He could feel the air moving all round him. He fell to the ground and started crawling. The noise of flapping and squeaking grew less and less as the bats flew away down the tunnel. Then he came to the steps. He stood up and started to climb. Up and round he went. Somewhere below him, he heard a footstep on the stairs. He listened hard. Someone was following him up the stairs. Philip stood where he was and stamped his feet as if he were going upstairs. When he stopped, he heard some footsteps just round the corner. Then something landed on his shoulder and gave him a friendly peck on the ear. It was the robin. Philip felt warm feathers against his neck. "Is that you, Baby Bee?" he called down the stairs.
"No,"
said Baby Bee's voice. "Who is it then?"
"No one. It's not me, Flip-Pip. Only it will be me if you aren't angry."
It was so good to hear a friendly voice in the dark that Philip couldn't be angry, even though Baby Bee shouldn't have come. "I'm not angry," he said, and sat down on the stairs. He heard Baby Bee climb the steps up to him, and then felt the little beaver jump onto his lap and give him a hug round the neck. Philip hugged him back.
I expect I was a bit scared in the dark,"
whispered Baby Bee in Philip's ear. "I expect I was too," said Philip.
"Can I come with you to the castle, Flip-Pip?"
"Well, since you're already here—"
"It's bestest when there's 3 of us, isn't it? Me and Robin and you."
"Yes," said Philip, "it is." They climbed the rest of the stairs together, and in the darkness they bumped into the wall at the top. Philip knew this must be the secret door into the library. He took a deep breath and pushed. Slowly the wall creaked and began to swing open. Philip peeped through the gap. There was a flickering light from the flaming torch on the wall. He listened. Not a sound. They were in luck. The room was empty. Philip tiptoed into the library, and Baby Bee followed. The wall they had pushed open looked like all the others, full of books. Philip took the torch and held it up to the books in order to see better. "I think this is right, Baby Bee. Mr. Edgar said it was on the shelves next to the secret passageway. Now, let's see. A purple book, green books, blue books, red books, black books. Oh, but no purple ones. Oh, yes. Here. Oh, dear. There are 2. Mr. Edgar only mentioned 1. Which one do you think it could be, Baby Bee?" "Baby Bee?" Philip looked down. Baby Bee wasn't there. He turned round and saw to his horror that the little beaver was standing in the open doorway. "Baby Bee!
"What are you doing? Close the door. The growlers might see you." "I'm going to find my mummy and daddy," said Baby Bee, and he ran out into the corridor with the robin flying after him.
"No, Baby Bee, come back!" But it was too late. Baby Bee was already scampering away. Philip dashed to the door. He could hear Baby Bee's footsteps, and he called as loudly as he dared, but the footsteps didn't stop. Philip tore down the stairs 2 at a time. He'd only gone a couple of steps when he heard Baby Bee's voice coming from the other direction.
"Mummy, where are you?"
Baby Bee was shouting so loud that he would wake up every growler in the castle. Philip ran in the direction of the noise. He turned a corner into a brightly lit corridor. There were suits of armour all the way down one wall. At the far end, Baby Bee was standing, shouting at the top of his lungs. "Baby Bee!" Philip called, and the little beaver turned to face him. Philip put a finger to his lips and then beckoned. Baby Bee shook his head and moved away. He stopped with his back to a large door and shook his head again.
"I want my mummy!"
Philip saw the knob turn. and the door began to open behind Baby Bee. Evil green eyes shone from the doorway. "Look out!" Philip shouted, but a black claw swept down and grabbed the young beaver by the ears. Baby Bee screamed as the growler swung him up in the air. The robin flew towards the growler and tried to peck him. The growler opened its horrible mouth and howled as the little bird's beak nipped its nose. The savage yellow teeth snapped and caught one of the robin's tail feathers. The robin flew into a suit of armour, then dived for another attack. This time the growler was ready. It waited until the last minute, then raised its arm and swiped the bird with its claw. The robin crashed against the wall and fell into the ground in a shower of feathers. There was a moment of silence. Then Baby Bee began to cry. Philip raised his torch over his head and charged along the corridor. The growler took one look at the flames of the torch and darted back into the room. The door banged shut, and Philip heard a key rattle in the lock. He tried the doorknob, but it wouldn't move. He banged the torch at the door and heaved with all his might, but the wood was so thick that he knew he would never be able to break it down. He heard Baby Bee's voice calling faintly, and he put his ear to the door. "Run, Philip! Run!" The little beaver was shouting. Then there was a scream and a thud, and the voice stopped. Howls echoed round the castle, and footsteps were growing louder. Philip saw a group of growlers come running down a staircase on the right. He bent down and picked up the still robin. The bird's feathers were crumpled. One of his wings stuck out, and his chest was stained with a deeper red than usual. The growlers were nearly there, but Philip gently put the robin in his pocket. The leading growler raised its claws ready to pounce. Philip ducked and darted back along the corridor. He pulled quickly at each suit of armour as he passed, and they all fell with loud clangs behind him. He turned the corner and saw the growlers tripping and falling over each other as they tried to jump the crashing armour. He ran along the corridor, up the stairs and along the hall to the library. He slammed the door shut and pushed a chair against it. Then he dashed to the bookshelves and reached for the purple books. There was a terrible growling and banging on the door. One of the books fell out of his hand. The chair began to slide forward as the growlers pushed the door. There was no time to pick up the other book as he dived into the secret passageway. He pushed the wall and it closed. A second later, he heard the chair go flying as the growlers burst through the door into the library. There were astonished grunts and growls as the evil creatures saw the empty room. Then there was a crash of books and furniture as they began to tear the room apart looking for him. He held the torch up high and dashed down the steps. He ran and ran. Down the steps and along the endless wet tunnel he went. He felt the fresh air hit him as he burst through the ferns at the end of the tunnel, but he didn't stop. When he burst into Mrs. Badger's parlour, he saw her get up. He saw her begin to open her mouth, but he didn't hear her scream, because he felt the room spin, and he fell to the floor. When Philip woke up, he was still lying on the floor, but there was a pillow under his head and a blanket tucked around him. Mrs. Badger was sitting in her rocking chair. The robin was lying in her lap, and as she stroked his feathers, big tears rolled down her striped face. "The growlers have got Baby Bee," said Philip. Mrs. Badger nodded. "The robin told me. The poor thing's broken both his wings. He's asleep now. Will he be all right? We must wait for Mr. Edgar. He's very clever at things like that. I'll just put him on a bed of cotton wool in the kitchen. It's nice and warm in there. Then I'll make some broth for you." Philip felt weak. When he tried to get up, his legs were very wobbly, and his whole body ached. The broth was hot and tasty. Philip got up and sat with Mrs. Badger in front of the fire. She sighed and said, "Bless my soul, and oh dear me," when he told her what had happened in Beaver Towers. "What about the word?" she asked at last. "What word?" said Philip. "While I was putting the bandage on the robin's cuts, he kept saying, 'Flippip knows the word. Flying, flying, Flippip knows the word.' The poor thing was in a lot of pain. It hurt him to speak, but he said it over and over." "I can't think what he meant," said Philip, thinking hard. "Oh, well, folks say funny things when they're in pain." Mrs. Badger got up and looked out of the window. "It's nearly morning. Mr. Edgar should be here soon."
Philip sat wondering about what the robin had said. What word did he mean? Something to do with flying. Bird, wing, kite, feather. The sun was just beginning to peer through the dawn mist when Philip heard a noise coming towards the house. It was a clattery, clanking, clinking sort of sound, mixed with some grunts and shouts of heave, ho. Philip got up and looked out of the front door and saw a very old open car bumping slowly across the fields. Mr. Edgar was sitting in it and holding the steering wheel, but he wasn't really driving it. Philip could just see 3 pairs of legs pushing very hard from behind. The car squeaked and rattled up to the house, then stopped. 3 hedgehogs in oily overalls rushed round from the back, and 2 of them saluted, while the 3rd pulled the door handle of the car. "Morning, young un," Mr. Edgar said, taking off his huge pair of goggles. "What do you think of me dratted car? Well done, mechanics," he said, saluting the 3 hedgehogs. "Walk out and take a rest." The hedgehogs took out dusters and started polishing the car furiously. "They love the dratted thing," Mr. Edgar said, taking Philip's arm. "Can't get 'em to stop working on it. Polish, polish all the day. Be quicker to walk even for an old duffer like me, but they'd be so upset. Anyway, enough of that. Did you get the book?"
"I don't know whether it's the right one. There were 2, you see, but, oh, Mr. Badger, something terrible's happened. The growlers have got Baby B, and they've hurt the robin, and his wings are broken, and Baby B's a prisoner, and Mrs. Badger said that you might be able to help the robin, but he's terribly ill, and he thinks I know a word, but I don't know what it is, and—"
"Hold your horses, lad," said Mr. Edgar, looking very anxious. "Tell me slowly, one thing at a time."
Philip told him the whole story, and Mr. Edgar's old face grew more and more worried.
"That foolish little beaver," he said. "I just hope... well, first things first. I'll see what I can do for our injured robin, and then I'll have a look at the book. I just hope, for all our sakes, it's the right one."
Mr. Edgar stepped inside the house. Philip looked at the 3 hedgehogs fussing round the car. They were blowing on the paint and rubbing very hard with their dusters. The car shone and sparkled so much that Philip was surprised to see that the tyres were flat and that one of them even had a bandage wrapped round it. "Hello," he said, walking over to the car. "I'm Philip." The 3 hedgehogs stopped polishing and saluted.
"Nick,"
said the big hedgehog.
"Anne,"
said the next.
"Nick,"
said the smallest. Then he giggled and hid his face behind his duster.
"He's shy,"
said the other 2, and pushed in behind them. "Nick?
Nick."
Oh, that's why you're called the mechanics. That's very clever. It's a pity you have to have a girl's name, though," Philip said to the one called Anne.
"What do you mean? I am a girl. What a cheek! Just because I work on the car, people always think I'm a boy."
Oh, I'm sorry," Philip said. "It's just that, well, you see, I don't know how to tell if hedgehogs are girls or boys." Philip decided it would be best to change the subject, so he asked Mick and Anne why the car didn't work.
"Of course it works," said Mick. "How do you think it got here?"
"I thought you were pushing it." "But what about the engine?" asked Philip. "Haven't you tried starting it?"
"Engine?"
Mick and Anne said together, then looked at each other as though they thought Philip was being silly.
"Yes, cars have engines that make the wheels turn round. That's why they're called motor cars." "Ours is not called that," said Mick. "Ours is called Doris."
"You don't know much about cars, do you?" said Anne. "Not much," admitted Philip, "but I do know that cars have engines, and I also know that tyres should be blown up."
"That's what Mr. Edgar said, but it just made a hole in it when we tried. Look," said Anne, pointing to the tyre with the bandage on. Perhaps we used too much dynamite."
"That's not quite what I meant," Philip said. He thought he'd better change the subject again. "Would you mind if I sat in the car?"
"Not at all,"
said Anne. The mechanics set to with their dusters, and Philip climbed over the door into the front seat. He held the steering wheel and turned it from side to side. It was very different from his father's car. Philip had often been allowed to pretend he was driving when the car was in the garage. His father had even showed him how to start the car by turning a key. He looked down and saw a key. Should he try? It was a very old car, but perhaps it still worked. He turned the key, and a little red light came on just as it did on their car at home. But when he tried to turn it some more, it wouldn't move. Then he saw a button just above the key. Something was written on it, but it was very faded. He bent down and peered at it. There was an S at the beginning, then 2 letters that he couldn't read, then R-T. "It must be start," he said out loud. Philip looked at the button. He leaned forward and put his finger on it. Then he closed his eyes and pushed. There was a whir and a clatter, then a very loud bang. A huge puff of smoke shot out of the back of the car. The mechanics jumped into the air, dropped their dusters and bolted away. Philip saw them dive into a ditch just as the car started to rattle and shake. It was working. It was jolting and coughing and rocking and wiggling, but it was working. There were 3 more loud bangs and 3 more puffs of smoke. Then Philip switched it off. The car bounced a couple of times, then stopped. He stood up and cheered. 3 very scared and wet hedgehogs slowly appeared from the ditch. He jumped out of the car and ran over to meet them. "It works!" he shouted.
"Oh, what did you do to Doris?" asked Mick.
"I just started her," Philip laughed.
"She was shooting at us," Mick said. "You must have made her angry."
"And you set fire to her," Anne added. "Look at the smoke."
"No," Philip said. "That's only because she's old and hasn't been going for a long time. Isn't it good, though? She'll go by herself now. What's the matter? Aren't you pleased?" The mechanics didn't look at all pleased. They hung their heads and looked very sad.
"Do you mean we won't be able to push Doris any more?" said Nick.
And there wasn't the slightest giggle in his voice. "Well, you won't have to, because the engine will do the work." Philip tried to sound cheerful, but he could see that they didn't think it was a very good idea. "Perhaps," he went on, "it's still better to push her. She is rather old."
"And she did make lots of noise, so perhaps she doesn't like going by herself," Mick suggested.
"Yes, and there was all that smoke,"
said Anne. "And bangs might scare everyone," Nick said from behind Anne.
"Especially Mr. Edgar," added Anne, "so perhaps it would be best if you didn't tell him about it."
Philip smiled and looked at the mechanics. Their overalls were soaking wet, and their prickles had bits of weed sticking to them. "You're quite right," he said. "Doris is much nicer when she doesn't make all that noise and that smelly smoke. I'm sure that Mr. Edgar prefers her to be pushed. It's best not to say anything." The 3 hedgehogs jumped up and down and cheered and patted Philip's back. They rushed off, picked up their dusters, and walked towards the car.
"Mrs. Badger's just gone out to pick some herbs," said Mr. Edgar as they sat down in the parlour. "We'll mix them up and give them to the robin. He's very poorly, I'm afraid, and those wings of his are going to take a long time to mend."
"Did you ask him what he told Mrs. Badger? Flip knows the word. That's what he said." Mr. Edgar shook his head.
"No, he's much too ill to talk."
"Perhaps he'll be able to tell me in a couple of days," Philip said.
"I'm afraid that will be too late. You did what you could, young un, but I'm sorry to say that it was the wrong book. Drat it! Never knew there were 2 purple books. This one's very queer indeed. All the pages are blank. Have a look."
Mr. Edgar got up and looked round the room.
"Are my old eyes getting worse, or has it gone dark all of a sudden? Can't see the dratted book. Can't even see the dratted table."
It had got darker. 5 minutes ago it had been sunny, but now it looked almost like night outside. Philip rushed to the window and saw a flash of lightning jump from the black clouds and strike a tree at the edge of the forest. The tree split and fell to the ground just as the thunder roared and shook the house. The front door burst open and the mechanics tumbled in. There was another crash of thunder, and they screamed and rolled up into 3 prickly balls.
I don't like the look of this at all," whispered Mr. Edgar. "This is no ordinary storm. Oyin is behind it, I'm sure. It's a magic storm that she sent from the world of blackness. She means to catch us before she comes back to the island tonight. Watch through the window for Mrs. Badger. I'll go and fetch the robin in here."
Philip peered through the window. The rain on the glass made it hard to see. Lightning flashed across the sky, and Philip gasped as he saw it light up hundreds of green eyes at the edge of the forest. "Growlers!" he shouted. "Quick, Mr. Edgar! Growlers in the forest! I saw their eyes!"
"Just as I thought," Mr. Edgar said, laying the robin's bed down by the fire. He hurried over to the window. "They've come to get us. Quick, lad, lock the doors."
Philip dashed to the front door and turned the key. He ran into the kitchen and went towards the back door. He was just reaching out for the key when the handle turned and the door began to open. He stepped back and grabbed a heavy saucepan. A black snout appeared round the door. He raised the pan and was just about to throw it when he saw that the snout belonged to a very wet Mrs. Badger.
"Mrs. Badger, thank
goodness!" cried Mr. Edgar. "Sit down and catch your breath."
Mrs. Badger sat on a small stool, and her fur began to steam as the fire warmed her up.
"Oh, growlers, Mr. Edgar," she panted. "Everywhere, all around us. I saw them coming, and I ran and ran. I have never seen so many."
"Aye, ma'am, I know. It's all Oyin's wicked work. She sent this storm so that the growlers could have some darkness to hide in. Still, it takes a lot of strength to make a magic storm. Even she won't be able to keep it going for very long. If we can hold them off for half an hour, the storm will die out. As soon as the light comes back, the growlers will slink away to the castle again." "Cowards!" he shouted, shaking his fist at the window.
"What do you think they'll do?" whispered Philip.
"Attack, of course,"
said Mr. Edgar, lowering his voice so that Mrs. Badger would not hear.
"And soon, too."
Suddenly there was a crash of broken glass from the kitchen. Philip ran to look. A growler had broken the window and was trying to crawl in. Philip grabbed the frying pan and threw it. The growler yelped and ducked back into the darkness. There was another crash, and the parlour window broke as a stone came flying through it. Mrs. Badger screamed and hugged the robin tight. The sofa began to move as the mechanics shook and shivered underneath it. Mr. Edgar took a big poker from the fireplace and rushed across to the window.
"The first one through here will get a sore head," he shouted. "Oh, if only I had a tank instead of that dratted car, I'd show you bullies what's what."
The car, of course! Philip ran to the front door and started to unlock it.
"Where are you going? Come back!"
called Mr. Edgar. But Philip pulled the door open and ran out into the darkness. A thick mist was swirling round the house. It had nearly stopped raining. If only he could frighten the growlers for a few minutes, the storm would be over. Philip ducked down behind a bush and listened. There was the padding of paws. 6 growlers loomed out of the mist and ran by him towards the house. There were growlings and howlings and snufflings and the sound of breaking glass. Philip dashed to the car, climbed over the door and crouched down. He sat on the seat and turned the key. The red light came on. Now to start it. The bangs and smoke would be sure to scare the growlers. He pressed the button. With a whir and a clatter like before, but nothing else. The engine hadn't started. He tried again. The engine whirred and clattered and stopped. He peered through the mist. Dark shapes were moving slowly towards the car. The growlers had heard the noise. Their green eyes were searching for him in the mist. He pressed the button and the engine whirred and stopped. It must have got wet during the storm. It wasn't going to start. He looked up. The growlers were in a circle all round him. Their eyes grew larger as they saw him. They bared their yellow teeth and raised their claws. The circle closed in. He could hear low growls rattling in their throats. He felt the car move as one of them jumped onto the back. He pressed the button. Whir, clatter, bang! The engine burst into life. Bang, bang, bang! The growlers jumped back in shock, and there were so many of them that they bumped into each other and fell over. They scrambled to their feet, then tripped and fell again in a howling, whining tumble of bodies. Pushed the gear stick hard, and the car started to move forward. It rattled and banged, even more now that it was moving. The growlers ran as if they were being chased by a dragon. Round and round they went in the mist, like scared rabbits. Philip turned the wheel, and the car chased them. They howled and pushed and bit each other in their hurry to get away. Philip saw the mist getting thinner. The magic storm was over. He hooted the car's horn, and the growlers ran even faster. All at once, the mist lifted, and the sun beamed down. The growlers howled, covered their eyes, and ran off towards the darkness of the forest. Philip drove after them, cheering and laughing. When the last one had gone, Philip turned the car round and drove it back to Mrs. Badger's house. "Well done, young un!" shouted Mr. Edgar. "Oh, thank you," Mrs. Badger said, and gave Philip a loving squeeze. They went inside, and Mr. Edgar and Philip swept the glass and soot from the floor, while Mrs. Badger made some tea. Philip looked round for the purple book. What bad luck that he brought the wrong one. Now what were they going to do? There it was, under a chair. He picked it up and opened it. Mr. Edgar had said that the pages were empty, yet the first page had the letter P on it. He turned the first 6 pages. There was a letter on each page, and Philip felt a shiver run down his back. The 6 letters were P-H-I-L-I-P. "Mr. Edgar! Mr. Edgar! Look, the book! You said it didn't have any writing in it, but it's got my name!" Mr. Edgar rubbed his eyes.
"Oh, this is very odd. These letters weren't here when I looked before. They've grown here all by themselves, and, well, look, there are some more letters on the pages at the back of the book. P-I-L-I-H-P. Most peculiar. There's some sort of special sort of magic in this book. Now, let me think. By Jove!"
he said suddenly, and looked at the book again.
"Yes, it does. Well, rat me. The letters at the back are your name backwards."
Philip looked. Mr. Edgar was right. "What does it mean?" Philip asked.
"I'm not sure. It's a bit of a puzzle all round. Rat me, what is it? This book's trying to tell us something."
"Why would it have my name backwards?"
"Well," said Mr. Edgar, "there's a backwards of everything. Front and back, up and down, in and out. There's another side of everything. Opposites."
"Well," Philip said at last, "I don't know what it means." Mr. Edgar sighed.
"Nor do I. And I'm sure it's trying to help, trying to give advice or warning."
"There's only one way to find out," Philip said. Mr. Edgar stopped pacing.
"You mean go back into Beaver Towers?" he said quietly.
Philip nodded.
"Oh, you're right, of course," Mr. Edgar said. "That's why your name's in the magic book. But it's a terrible risk. It's nearly night. Oyin will be back soon."
"I know, but it is the only way, isn't it?"
"Yes, young un," Mr. Edgar said. "I'm afraid it is."
The sun was sinking behind Beaver Towers when Philip got to the secret tunnel. The forest had been strangely quiet, as though all the growlers had gone inside the castle to wait for their evil mistress. There was smoke rising from the castle, and Philip wondered if Oyin was already there. He crossed the glade, pulled aside the ferns, and looked down the steps to the tunnel. Half of him wanted to run away, but he thought of Baby B. He groped his way through the blackness, and at last he felt the bottom of the long staircase up to the secret doorway. He started to climb. A voice inside him told him to go back, but he forced his feet to climb. At the top, he put his ear to the wall and listened. There was no sound from the library, so he pushed gently, and the wall swung open. The room was in a terrible mess. Torn books lay all over the floor. The voice inside spoke to him again, stronger than ever. It told him to look for the book and read the escaping spell. Then he could magic himself home, away from the growlers and away from Oyin. Far away, he heard Baby B's voice. He couldn't hear the words, but the little beaver was shouting. Philip got up and walked to the door. The voice inside him told him to keep looking for the book, but Baby B's call was stronger, even though it was so small and faint. He opened the library door slowly and looked along the corridor. It was empty. He tiptoed across the corridor, opened a window and looked down. Far below him was a courtyard. In the middle, a huge fire was burning. Hundreds of growlers were lined up round the walls. In front of the fire stood all the animals that the growlers had taken prisoner. On the other side of the fire was an empty chair raised on some blocks so that it looked like a throne. Philip knew at once that the chair was meant for Oyin. The growlers were waiting for the witch to come back from the world of blackness and take her seat like an evil queen. Then she would give the word of command, and the beavers, badgers, rabbits, and hedgehogs would be thrown onto the fire. A small face turned and looked up at the window. It was Baby B. Before Philip could make a sign to tell him not to say anything, the little beaver's voice was echoing round the courtyard. "It's Flip-Hip!
Flipip's come! A growler stepped forward and knocked Baby Bee to the ground. 2 big beavers picked him up and tried to hush his sobs and tears. At least Baby Bee had found his parents. All the animals looked up at Philip, but the growlers didn't move. They kept their green eyes fixed on the empty throne. It was as if they knew that it was too late for him to do anything. He suddenly felt very small and afraid. "Philip!" a voice called from behind him. He turned and came face to face with a boy who looked exactly like him. The clothes, the face, everything was the same. It was just like looking at himself in a mirror. "Who are you?" Philip asked. The boy smiled with his mouth, but his eyes were cold as he said, "Don't worry, I've come to get you out of this mess. I've found the book. Come and look." The boy walked slowly into the library and pointed. The purple book was on the table. "Let's hurry," the boy said. "Oyin will be here soon and it will be too late. We must get home. I'll say the spell. All you have to do is to say yes to me." "But who are you?" Philip asked again. The boy smiled his icy smile. "I'm part of you, and if you don't mind me saying so, I'm the sensible part of you. If you'd listened to me on the stairs, we wouldn't be here taking silly risks. You don't want to end up on the fire, do you?" Philip shook his head. "Well, come on then, say yes, and let's get home." But Baby Bee," Philip began. "He's just a silly little beaver. He's a prisoner because he was stupid and didn't listen to you. And what's worse, he almost got you caught too. Don't waste your pity on him." The boy was right. All he had to do was to say yes and he would be home, and yet something was not quite right. The boy was looking hard at him, and Philip could feel the word yes filling his brain. Come on, the boy was growing angry. "Just say the word. You know the word." The word! The robin had said that too. The robin had told Mrs. Beaver. Flipip knows the word. If only he could think. "All right," Philip said, "I'll say the word, but only if you can write down my name." "Why should I do that?" the boy asked angrily. "Well, so that I'll know that you really are a part of me. It's hard to spell the name. If you get it right, I'll believe you." He bent over the table and started to write. He held the pencil in his fist, and he wrote slowly, like a baby. Philip felt himself beginning to think clearly again. He thought of Mr. Edgar, Baby Bee, Mrs. Badger. They were his friends. He couldn't just leave them on this island. The island. That was funny. The boy had said islands. Philip had forgotten that there were 2. There was the big one shaped like an N, and there was the little round one by its side. Fancy forgetting the little one. He'd seen it from the kite when he had been flying. Flipip knows the word, flying. Of course, that was the word that the robin meant. The island spelt no, and yet the boy who looked like him was trying to make him say yes. Yes to what? "Finished," the boy said, and Philip's thoughts were cut short. The boy looked at him with his cold, staring eyes, and Philip's brain was filled with the word yes. "I've written our name down. Now, all you have to do is to say the word." The word was hurting Philip's head. "Wait a minute," he managed to say. "Show me the name. I want to see if you've got it right." The boy passed the piece of paper across and laughed. "Of course I got it right. It's my name as well as yours." Philip bit his tongue to stop the word yes coming out. Then he looked at the paper. In big, straggly letters, the boy had written P-I-L-I-H-P. "It's wrong!" Philip shouted. "It's backwards! You're not me!" "I am," said the boy. "Say it! Say yes to me!" Philip's head was pounding. His lips were beginning to move. The boy was trying to pull the word out of him. He wouldn't say what the boy wanted. Philip felt as if he was screaming, but the word came out as a whisper. "No." The pain in his head stopped. The boy stepped back, and his face grew so pale that Philip thought he could see right through the boy's skin to the bones. "What did you say?" the boy asked, and his voice was changing. It was becoming crackly and grating. Philip filled his lungs and shouted with all his might, "No!" The room shook, and a wind began to howl through the door. A blood-red light glowed round the boy. Books started to fly through the air. The boy was growing taller, and his face was beginning to melt. The skin was becoming older. The eyes were turning yellow. The mouth was filling with broken teeth. Ugly lumps bulged on the skin. It was Oyin. "Curse you! Curse you!" screamed the witch. She held up her twisted hands and pointed her long, bony fingers at Philip. He pressed himself against the wall as she stepped towards him. Green fire flashed in her slit eyes. "I'll teach you," she hissed. Her foul mouth oozed round his face. "I'll teach you to say no to me. You've ruined everything. I could have been queen here, but now—" The library window flew open, and Oyin turned and listened. Philip couldn't hear anything, but his ears hurt as if a loud voice was booming through the room.